Today on The Conservative Rebel, the Democrat governor of Kansas is allowing a mob of Satanists to perform a blasphemous ritual of devil worship on the grounds of the Kansas State House. She claims she can't stop it because that would allegedly violate the principle of free speech. According to the Democrats, it's perfectly fine to throw people in prison for praying or singing hymns outside abortion mills, but stopping Satanists from dedicating your state government to the devil is apparently a step too far. Also, a federal judge is very upset that President Trump didn't obey his order to send a plane full of drug traffickers and terrorists he was deporting back to the U.S. to victimize more Americans. And Trump scores a major victory for the conservative movement by finally signing an order to abolish the Department of Education. You won't want to miss today's episode of The Conservative Rebel. Two weeks ago, we talked about the movement gaining popularity in red states to restore school prayer and put the Ten Commandments back in school. A few days ago, bills doing both those things finally passed the Texas Senate, meaning Texas is well on its way to join Louisiana and other states in the fight to take back the culture from the secularists and from the left. But while Texas begins to restore Christian principles, just a little to the north in Kansas, a very different story has been unfolding. Democrat Governor Laura Kelly, a woman who positions herself as a moderate and who even claims to be a Christian, is letting a group of Satanists use the grounds of the Kansas state capitol for a demonic, blasphemous, so-called Black Mass ceremony scheduled for March 28th that's explicitly designed to mock Christianity. The Satanic Grotto, which is the organization that planned the event, advertised with statements like this, quote, "Join us at the Topeka Capitol building in Kansas as we dedicate the grounds and our legislature to the glory of Satan. We will be performing rites to the Black Mass and indulging in sacrilegious blaspheme. God will fall, and Kansas will be embraced by the black flame of Lucifer." Yeah, you heard that correctly. In several days, March 28th, these scumbags are literally going to dedicate the government of Kansas to the devil. And originally, Laura Kelly did absolutely nothing about it, because of course she couldn't care less if a group of devil-worshipping cultists used the seat of the state government to commit blasphemy. That didn't bother her. It didn't fill her with the kind of rage any sane person would feel at that. After all, the organization planning this event is openly left-wing, anti-life, woke, and pro-LGBT, which are all things she agrees with. They were planning on using the ritual to protest pro-life laws, which she also opposes. As the leader of the so-called Satanic Grotto himself said, quote, "This is a specific response to our legislatures continuing to pander to groups like the Kansas Catholic Conference and to Kansans for Life, where they keep trying to come back and attack abortion rights, much less other rights. Because, of course, there's nothing Satanists love more than abortion. But eventually, after local Christian organizations started putting political pressure on her, as they should, they were rightfully outraged at what was going to happen. Kelly finally caved a little bit half-heartedly. But she didn't respond by shutting the event down, as any governor in his right mind would do. No, instead, she issued this weak, pathetic statement, quote, "There are more constructive ways to protest and express disagreements without insulting or denigrating sacred religious symbols. However, as governor, I also have a duty to protect protesters' constitutional rights to freedom of speech and expression, regardless of how offensive or distasteful I find the content to be. Since these rights are constitutionally protected, the governor's office has limited authority to respond to such actions. Therefore, all events planned for March 28th will be moved outdoors to the grounds surrounding the State House. Now, of course, the media and even places like Fox have framed this as some sort of decisive action taken by Laura Kelly. She sure got real tough on those Satanists. She told them to dedicate the state to the devil outdoors. See, before they were going to dedicate the state to the devil indoors, but now they're doing it outdoors because of Laura Kelly. She looked at those Satanists right in the eye and politely asked, "Could you please commit blasphemy and dedicate the state to Satan outside? It would bother me if you did it inside." Plant a medal around her neck. A big round of applause for Laura Kelly. Her courage is an inspiration to us all. What more could she have possibly done, the media seems to be asking. To find out, imagine this. Imagine a bunch of people showed up at the Kansas State House to mock and insult and defame Muslims and to publicly burn the Koran while shouting about the fall of Allah and the fall of Islam and cleansing the state of Muslim influence. How many seconds do you think it would take before law enforcement was called in and the protesters were dragged off government property? How many seconds do you think that would take? 2? 5? They would be fined. They would be thrown in prison. The book would be thrown at them. They would be charged with hate crimes. They would be thrown behind bars, and Laura Kelly would make sure the ringleaders never saw the outside of a prison cell again. And instantly, everyone across the country would be condemning the anti-Muslim demonstration as a hateful, bigoted, far-right instance of protest. Instantly, it would be a news cycle that would last for weeks and weeks and weeks. Years later, children would still hear about the great Islamophobic or neo-Nazi rally of 2025 in Topeka, Kansas. We all know that's what would happen. These Satanists are doing the exact same thing. The exact same thing. It's just that instead of attacking Muslims, or attacking Jewish people, or Buddhists, or whatever other religion, they're attacking Christians. Why doesn't Laura Kelly intervene to stop these Satanists from spewing anti-Christian hate and mocking Christians, like she would in 2 seconds if they did the same to Muslims? Why doesn't she intervene to stop these scumbags from dedicating the state she governs to the devil? Because she doesn't see much problem with it. Elected Democrats don't see any problem with it. In fact, they endorse it. They approve of blasphemy. They see devil-worshipping cultists mocking Christianity, and their reaction is either neutral or approval. And if you think that's too harsh, consider this. I'm actually giving the Democrats the benefit of the doubt on that one. Because the alternative option, if you want to go down that road, is that Laura Kelly and Kansas Democrats don't approve of blasphemy, they don't want their state to be dedicated to the devil, but they're such spineless, squeamish, wimpy, cowardly sissies that they're too afraid to do anything to stop a demonic ritual they know to be a great moral evil. And if we're being perfectly honest, that might be the worst of the two options. And yet we'll hear all these dumb excuses from the left about the Satanists having a right to publicly dedicate their state to the devil on government property, which, as we all know, is one of the most sacred freedoms our founding fathers guaranteed in the Constitution. Because if the Kansas government takes away our freedom to commit blasphemy and to hold demonic rituals on government property, what right won't they try to take away? We let them maintain order on government property, and soon they might be, who knows, rounding up peaceful pro-life activists and J6 protesters and imprisoning them, or some crazy, unthinkable thing like that would never, ever happen in America. As we all know now, it's right there in the First Amendment, which says, Satanists have an inalienable God-given right to hold blasphemous ceremonies mocking Christians on government property. It's right there in the Constitution. If only those MAGA rednecks would look at the Constitution for 2 seconds, then they'd know that. These are all the same arguments, all the same excuses we heard last year, I think it was, when a Christian man heroically took down a blasphemous satanic display at the Iowa State Capitol, only to be accused of committing a hate crime against devil worshippers. And the arguments and excuses are just as stupid as they were then. Constitutional right? What do you mean, constitutional right? Since when have the Democrats cared about constitutional rights? Under Democrat rule, 23 peaceful pro-lifers were arrested and jailed for the crime of praying and singing hymns outside abortion mills. Under Democrat rule, 1,500 peaceful, completely nonviolent J6 protesters were imprisoned, ripped from their families, and in general had their lives turned into a living hell because they peacefully voiced their political opinions. That was on government property, just like this satanic ritual is going to be on government property. J6 was on government property. If you can arrest people for peacefully protesting that, then yeah, you can arrest people for blaspheming on government property and for dedicating the state to the devil. And let's not forget the millions of people who were censored, shamed, canceled, or had their careers destroyed by Democrats for refusing to inject themselves with the experimental COVID drug. So according to the Democrats, it's perfectly fine and unobjectionable to throw people in prison for praying or singing hymns, but stopping Satanists from dedicating your state government to the devil is apparently a step too far. That's too far. That's too extreme. We can't do that. For 4 years, the left never pretended to care about constitutional rights or free speech or any of that. Instead, they locked up their political opponents and censored their critics and even tried to imprison Trump. But the second the Satanists show up to mock Christianity, that's when the Democrats start talking about free speech. That's when these hypocrites start talking about the Constitution. All of it is fake. All of it is a lie. All it would take to make this issue disappear would just say to the Satanists, sorry, you can't hold your demonic ritual on government property. Sorry guys, hate to be a party pooper, but you can't dedicate our government to the devil. We have no obligation to let you do that on government property. You don't own this property. Get out. That's all Laura Kelly has to say, but she can't bring herself to do it. And I don't know, she could be another anti-Christian leftist, she could just be a coward, she could be genuinely stupid and not understand what the First Amendment means. I don't know. But one thing is clear from all this. As long as Christians continue to sit back, as long as they continue to be too afraid to fight back against the radical left, too afraid to speak out against the evils they have brought upon our country, too afraid to use political power to fight fire with fire, to win the culture war, to advance the cause of truth and justice and Christianity. Unless they do that, this is precisely the type of thing we can expect to see a lot more of. Alright, on that happy note, let's get to our next topic. About a week ago, as you've probably heard by now, Trump deported a plane full of criminals and terrorists, including members of a drug gang, to El Salvador. They're now being imprisoned, as they should be, in one of the strictest and harshest and most hellish prisons in the world. Maybe you've seen the videos, they're quite satisfying to watch. But partway through the flight, Judge James Boasberg ordered that the plane be turned around and the dangerous terrorists and drug traffickers brought back to the United States, as was his clear moral and constitutional duty. The plane did not obey his command, though, and he's quite upset about that. Politico has this. Quote, U.S. District Judge James Boasberg vowed Friday to determine whether the Trump administration defied his command to turn around planes bound for El Salvador, carrying Venezuelan immigrants Trump claimed were members of a terrorist gang. Quote, the government's not being terribly cooperative, the judge said during an afternoon hearing, before making it clear that he was not dropping his quest to establish whether his Saturday directive was ignored or deliberately breached. Quote, I will get to the bottom of whether they violated my order, who ordered this, and what the consequences will be. What the consequences will be? What does this judge think he is, Trump's dad? What does he think Trump is, 7? Is he going to send him to bed without his dinner, or revoke his video game privileges for the week? What authority does James Boasberg have to punish the president for anything? How many divisions does this guy command? That's what I want to know. The article continues, quote, Boasberg's hearing offered the latest drama in the extraordinary showdown between the Chief Justice of the District Court in Washington and President Donald Trump, who this week decried Boasberg as a, quote, radical left lunatic and endorsed calls for his impeachment. The judge portrayed Trump's invocation of war powers last week, part of a secretive effort to summarily deport hundreds of Venezuelans to harsh conditions in a Salvadoran prison, as a potentially, quote, alarming assertion of executive power, which the administration claims is virtually unreviewable by any court. Why was this proclamation essentially signed in the dark on Friday, and then these people rushed into planes? Boasberg asked. So far, the Trump administration has declined to say precisely when Trump signed the proclamation. It seems to me the only reason to do that is if you know it's a problem and you want to get them out of the country before there are suits filed, the judge said. Boasberg also repeated warnings Friday about the breadth of the powers Trump has claimed. The judge said Trump's actions raised a series of, quote, very frightening possibilities, including that the president could declare an invasion by almost any group of foreigners and throw them out of the country. Now, if you've had the misfortune to pay any attention to what NBC, CNN, AP, or other mainstream left-wing news outlets have been saying this past week, you know that this is a whole outrage cycle. The media is very much outraged, like this judge is, that President Trump did not immediately order the plane filled with dangerous terrorists and drug traffickers who were selling poison in the United States to turn around and come back to our country. They are very upset that that did not happen. And depending on the way you look at it, that can either be depressing or make you feel very, very optimistic going forward into the future. And obviously it can be depressing because how could anyone be so insanely out of touch as to think that terrorists and drug traders should not be deported? How could anyone be that dumb? That's how it could depress you. The way it could make you more optimistic is that this makes me feel really good about our chances in 2026 and in 2028. If the Democrats are so tone deaf, if the Democrats are so clueless and out of touch that they are crying crocodile tears about terrorists and drug traders, that those people are not in the U.S., in the streets, continuing to victimize Americans, and are instead in prison where they belong, If they keep doing that, the Democrats are going to have a very hard time in 2026 and 2028 and going into the future beyond that. I'll tell you that. So please, Democrats, please cry harder about this. Yes, yes, keep this a news cycle. Keep ranting about this. That will be great. That will win over the normies like nothing else. That's how you attract independent voters. There you go. You have your talking point. Trump is terrible because he ships away terrorists to other countries. Go with that. You'll do great. Nominate Tim Walz and have Tim Walz run on that. That will be even better. You guys should do that. But all of that aside, this just is yet another example of what we talked about last week. It's another example of the tyranny of activist judges who think they can micromanage everything the president does. Activist judges who think they have unlimited power to do anything they want without accountability to anyone. What was the term the article used? Command. That's the term they used. The leftist hack judge commanded a plane in the sky to turn around. So the plane needed to turn around because he commanded it. That's what these people think. They think they have control over how the White House manages its websites. A federal judge literally issued a ruling restricting the Trump administration from modifying a website. They think they have control over who can join the army. A judge just ruled that Trump's ban on trans-identifying recruits, so-called, joining the army is unconstitutional. They think they have control over who gets to be a citizen. They revoked Trump's birthright citizenship order. And these judges think they have authority to be air traffic controllers who can command planes to move in certain directions. What don't these people think they can do? The answer is nothing. Federal judges think they have unlimited power, by and large, to do anything they want. They think that their rulings are final. And this elitist attitude is a great danger to the United States. Because if these judges are allowed to micromanage everything the president does, if they're allowed unlimited jurisdiction over every aspect of American politics, they become the rulers of the country, not the people. The power is taken from Trump. The power is taken from the people and instilled in unelected, unaccountable people like this. And these judges are used to that kind of power. They're used to having their orders obeyed without question. Which is why this judge is so bitter about the elected president not bending the knee to his every whim. And unfortunately for him and all other activist judges, they don't get a blank check anymore. That's why this one is throwing a hissy fit. But it's a wonderful thing that they don't get a blank check anymore. And this is long overdue. Judges have been ruling with impunity for so many years, but better late than never. This is a wonderful thing, and I will celebrate a victory where I can get it. Alright, here's some good news for once. CNN has this, quote, President Donald Trump on Thursday signed an executive order to begin dismantling the U.S. Department of Education, seeking to fulfill decades of conservative ambition to get rid of the agency. No president in modern history has tried to close down a cabinet-level agency. Shutting down the department wholesale would require an act of Congress, which created the agency in 1979. Trump officials acknowledge that they don't have the necessary votes to dissolve the department that way. Instead, the order Trump signed Thursday instructed Education Secretary Linda McMahon to take, quote, all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the Department of Education and return education authority to the states. Speaking in the East Room, surrounded by school children in uniforms sitting at classroom desks, Trump said, quote, we're going to shut it down and shut it down as quickly as possible. White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt said ahead of Thursday's signing that the order would, quote, greatly minimize the agency, but that certain critical functions like student loans and administering grants for at-risk students would remain under the agency's umbrella. Now, I won't give you the whole rant again about how the Department of Education has transformed our nation from one of the most intelligent countries on Earth into a nation of barely literate morons who spend all day on TikTok while they guzzle Red Bulls and stuff their faces full of Doritos. If you want that, you can go back and listen to the episode I already did on that topic. Because no one really denies that fact. Well, they might not use the same language I used, of course, but no one is denying that under the education department, reading scores have plummeted. No one is denying that literacy is plummeting, math scores are continuing to go down. No one is denying that after years of going through the government school system, Gen Z is still one of the most depressed and anxious and mentally ill generations in U.S. history. The data is just too overwhelming and damning for the education department for anyone to deny that. The leftists who are screaming about this aren't actually talking about that data. They're not arguing that the education department actually is good for reading scores because they can't. Instead, they've decided to fearmonger about various programs that eliminating the Department of Education would allegedly cut. It's a trend that you can see across different platforms. We're seeing headlines like this. Trump's executive order to dismantle education department risks chaos for student loans and grants. Trump's plan to abolish education department threatens civil rights enforcement in schools. That's a scary one. Trump's move to gut education department endangers low-income and disabled students. Here's what NPR had to say about it along the same lines. Quote, the federal government only provides a fraction of the money that goes to schools. States and local governments are responsible for the lion's share of that funding, but the federal government plays an outsized role in helping high-needs schools get the money they need to stay afloat. These federal grants can pay for things like school staff salaries, supplies, technology, tutoring programs, and a range of basic services that low-income schools may not otherwise be able to afford. So Trump's eliminating this thing that spends hundreds of billions of dollars on education, this massive behemoth, this massive bureaucracy, and they're choosing to hyperfixate on these tiny, tiny little programs that are just a couple $1 million in $100 billion agency, and they're choosing to talk about that. And that's the only part of the Department of Education they're even bothering to defend. The rest of it is just so indefensible that they're trying to emotionally engineer us by talking about how rural schools and minority schools and poor schools need these grants. And this just goes to show they're making Trump's argument for him. Okay, that's what these people are doing. They are making Trump's argument better than Trump could ever make it. Because in this whole massive, hundreds of billions of dollars bureaucracy, they can only find this little thing that they are willing to defend because all of the other money is wasted and they know it. But the casual reader who reads CNN and just gets his entire view of the world from CNN is not going to think hard about this, so they know they can use this to scare people. The fear-mongering has officially begun. But what's gonna happen if you do this? If Trump abolishes the education department, if Congress approves his executive order and codifies it into law, and Congress actually cooperates and abolishes this thing, worst case scenario, nothing happens, okay? Worst case scenario, reading scores are not affected, math scores are not affected at all, everything stays the same. Best case scenario, which not even best case scenario, but most likely scenario, is that they go way up because the Department of Education is no longer deliberately dumbing everything down and deliberately making our school system a flaming dumpster fire, and states can actually have more accountability. Schools can have more accountability to the parents. That's what's most likely to happen. But in the worst case scenario, where nothing happens, we're still saving hundreds of billions of dollars, and the people who read CNN, the people who read this propaganda about the grants for poor schools and rural schools, who read all this emotional sludge, all this propaganda about it, they're gonna be worried about this because they were programmed to be. As Trump said, unfortunately, these necessary programs, quote unquote, will just be done by other agencies. So these things that they're talking about are most likely just going to be taken up by other agencies. So people will have this programming that they need to be afraid, they need to be very afraid that the Department of Education is going to go away, and then nothing happens. No one in their life is affected, nothing in their life changes, and if anything, they notice an improvement in the public school educated children that they know. So what's going to happen when these people see that a massive bureaucracy was abolished and nothing in their life was affected at all except positively? They're gonna start questioning, what other federal bureaucracies might we abolish? What other things can we get rid of? What other money can we save? And I won't even notice at all, and no one will even notice at all. So the media might feel really good that they get to scare people about these student loans and grants, which is all going to continue anyway. In the short term, they get to attack Trump for abolishing the Department of Education in the short term. But in the long term, this is only going to hurt them, and it's only going to hurt their reputation. And that's actually one of the reasons why abolishing the Department of Education is a great idea. Not just because it has been a complete failure, but also because it's going to establish a precedent, is what it's going to do, of people seeing that federal agencies can be abolished and federal spending can be significantly slashed, and their life actually gets better for it instead of worse for it. And that's going to be a great thing for our country. So we'll see what happens. We'll see if Congress actually votes for this to be codified into law. Trump, again, does not need congressional approval for this. He is the chief executive. He is the head of the executive branch. But under the interpretation of the Constitution that pretty much everyone has accepted for a very long time, unfortunately, Trump needs Congress to vote for this. So we'll see what happens there, but for now, I'm just glad that Trump is actually moving in the direction. He's taken the decisive action. He's done the most that he thinks he possibly can to actually fulfill this campaign promise that Republicans have promised since Ronald Reagan. Since the 1980s, literally, the year after this was founded, Republicans have been promising to abolish the Department of Education, and Trump's finally doing something about it. So even if Congress doesn't approve it, this is still a great sign that Trump actually means business. He's made a couple blunders, but by and large, he means business, and he's far more serious about implementing his agenda than he was the first time around, certainly, and that's a very good thing. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Conservative Rebel. Please subscribe to our podcast, leave a like, and share. I'll see you on the next episode.